One important thing I would like to highlight here is the large size, the magnitude of the debt owned by developing countries. The entire debt relief for 36 countries was only 76 billion US dollars, and that was a comprehensive debt relief. And right now, if you look at African debt alone, it accounts to about 1.2 or 1.3 trillion US dollars. So the larger size of debt owned by developing countries itself makes debt restructuring very difficult. You need to have greater amount of liquidity. Of course, you also have the problem of debt composition. For instance, if you look at African debt, 43% is owed to private sectors and about 34% owed to multilateral institutions. So these two combined constitute about 80% of the total African debt, which means debt restructuring, you must involve the multilateral development banks, even though they have enjoyed the kind of special status, but they have to join because of the size, the magnitude, and the requirement for the need of liquidity. And if you look at bilateral official debt, it has been really declined. For Africa, it's about 23%. And for China, it's about 10 to 12%. So this kind of narrative given or prescribed or described in the mass media is not really correct, because it's a kind of geopolitics overshadowing the intellectual objectivity. So first thing is about its size and composition, which requires special ways for debt restructuring. And we also realize that for not only African countries, for most of the debtor countries nowadays, the rolling of debt service actually depends on new borrowing. And we know that if you ask central bank governors, you ask Jose Antonio, and you ask finance ministers, they all have a habit that every day they need to check the spread, because they are very much afraid that anything negative would increase the debt spread, and that would increase tremendously debt servicing and cost them a lot of money. So this dependence on rolling over old debt by raising new debt is a terrible weakness for the countries. For instance, after Ghana lost market access for 2 years, Ghana had to declare default. The same with other countries, like Sri Lanka, like others, they all have the same problem. So this would mean that credit rating is terribly, terribly important for these countries. If you recall the DSSI initiative under G20, 73 countries were eligible, but only about 48 countries use DSSI. It's not because they don't need the money, it's because they were afraid that once they tapped into DSSI, their credit rating will be downgraded. Even though in the process, credit rating agencies announced very clearly, if you only touch upon official bilateral lenders, you don't touch private sectors, the rating will be maintained at the same level. Still, not all countries applied to use DSSI. So here, it shows that debt restructuring is becoming also much more difficult, because the reliance on the international capital market and the fear of the credit rating agencies. So this is something that I would like to emphasize. And also, I would like to go to explain a little bit why there is a decline of Paris Club bilateral official creditors. And if you look at African countries, very little Paris Club creditors involved in the African debt. This is mainly because of the HIPIC initiative. If you look at the HIPIC initiative, first of all, it's not terribly large. Secondly, the responsibility, the cost is very much shared. There was the sales of IMF gold, and also there were pledges by the major donor countries. So, for instance, the United States also pledged $28 billion. Up to now, the US has not paid for this $28 billion. The rest of the countries paid. We know that African countries really need a lot of financing for development. And also there is another factor that the island has this population boom, which is good. It could be a kind of demographic dividend, but it can also be a burden. You have to feed all the mouths. So if you look at the catching up process, and you will see that Africa as a whole, the GDP by size has grown quite a bit. But if you look at per capita GDP for several decades, the African continent remains flat, stagnant per capita. So this requirement for financing for infrastructure, for development, and also for turning them from commodity exporters to more value-added exports require financing. Where does the financing come from? Here comes China. China came in to lend quite a great deal to the African continent, mostly for infrastructure and other things. And another major source was turning to private bond floating for getting the financing. Ghana was the first country in the African continent to float euro bonds back in 2007. So here comes the kind of tide for African countries to float euro or other bonds. And then a couple of years later, I went to the annual meeting of Bank and Fund, and I was attending the African Ministers of Finance meeting together with KPMG. And KPMG was really a kind of underwriter for bonds. So we too had two different tones. I was telling the African finance ministers, please be cautious, think about your debt carrying capacity. And KPMG would say this is the best golden chance for you to float bonds. And in the end, I failed. And we know about 12 or 15 African countries floated large size of bonds. So this actually the beginning of the African countries tapping into the private sector. And there are lots of fluctuations of interest rate and also mismatches of currency and original thing. You can see all kinds of problems from this. And people here and myself, we've been talking and written about reforming of the international debt architecture for decades. How much we have seen changed? Very little, incremental. Yeah. And in UNCTAD, between 2008 to 2015, we worked on a set of responsible principles for sovereign lending and borrowing. I was very much involved. I led a team on that. And the UNGA resolution actually endorsed that. That was taken from our analytical work. And that was a very inclusive process. We had IMF there, we have World Bank there, and the Paris Club Secretary General, and the famous scholars in the dead world. We have a who's who in the team to design the principles. It was endorsed by voting. But in the UNGA, habitually, procedurally, normally, it was by consensus. We were working on this roadmap on debt restructuring, and we mentioned about debt standstill, independent debt authorities. By that time, we called about independent debt institutes, which will do the DSA and advise countries and all that. But after this resolution, here comes the power play for the reform of international financial architecture and debt architecture. Because the major countries were against this resolution, after that, first of all, the funding for our project was suspended, and we had to return $1 million to the donors. Secondly, the work is basically dead because developed countries, originally Germany, Italy, Belgium, they were all endorsing us. And after that, they all disengaged. So that was a sentence of death for the project. Here is the kind of a power play. We have all the best ideas, best template. But if you don't have the support of the major stakeholders, you can go nowhere. The same with other initiatives. If you look at a common framework, there is too much emphasis and too much expectations of common framework. It was, first of all, not designed to be like a debt restructuring kind of new model, new mechanism. It was not designed to be so. If you're reading two letters, it meant for kind of extending a maturity. And it didn't mean to have a new debt restructuring mechanism. And right now, the debt restructuring is still really mastered, really be driven by the IMF. IMF does the DSA, which decides the magnitude of debt restructuring, debt relief, and my IMF really monitors the implementation of IMF program. They also mediate the kind of debt negotiation. At one meeting, quite important meeting, I just mentioned, I said for DSA, we had so many mistakes, or over optimistic, and there was a calculation wrong in the model, led to major suffering of that country, Greece. So I said, why don't you involve the United Nations in the designing of the DSA? Guess what happened? I was hugely attacked by the IMF and by some major stakeholders. So here you could see that you want to have this to be kind of controlled or governed or intervened by the United Nations, but the current political governance, the current system will not allow that to happen. So what can we try? Reform the quota system and also rechanneling the SDR and change that. And also right now is a good opportunity for Africa, because Africa, you have a new executive chairman in the IMF board, and South Africa is going to be the next G20 president. And also the African Union now is the 21st member of the G20. I think this is the time for Africa to play a more important role and also initiate changes to international debt architecture and international financial architecture as a whole.